Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
If you're joining us today, you are probably, well, you're that curious mind, the kind of always looking for the underlying mechanics of how things actually work.
Right, you're seeking a shortcut to being well-informed.
Exactly. And today, we have an absolute gem of a mission for you. We are going to unpack a meticulously detailed, and I mean detailed, medieval roadmap to human regret, sorrow, and ultimate transformation.
We're diving deep into the inner workings of the human conscience.
Yeah.
And we're using a text that is honestly just as psychologically revealing today as it was centuries ago.
It really is a psychological and theological schematic.
It truly is. The text we're dissecting today comes from the supplement to the third part of the Summa Theologica.
Now, for anyone vaguely familiar with medieval history or philosophy, the Summa Theologica is the towering achievement of St. Thomas Aquinas.
It's the bedrock of scholastic philosophy.
Bedrock. But the specific excerpts we're looking at today have this incredibly fascinating backstory that it completely colors how we should read and interpret the entire framework.
It does. And this historical plot twist is honestly my favorite part of the setup.
Because when most people hear St. Thomas Aquinas and his Summa, they picture this monumental, polished, definitive masterpiece.
Right. It's usually treated like the ultimate encyclopedia of medieval thought.
But that's not actually the case with the specific pages we're scrutinizing today.
Not at all.
Give us the backstory. How did this supplement actually come together?
Well, the truth is a bit of a historical tragedy, or perhaps a poetic culmination, depending on how you look at it.
Okay.
Thomas Aquinas actually died before finishing this part of his masterpiece.
He just didn't finish it.
Right. He was deep into writing the treatise on penance, literally mapping out the very concepts of human regret and divine forgiveness, when he was, as the editor's note rather beautifully puts it, called to his heavenly reward.
Wow.
He never finished the Summa. It just stops.
So the text we're reading today, the supplement wasn't actually penned by him in his final mature years.
Exactly. It was compiled after his death, most likely by his constant companion and incredibly close friend, Fra Reinaldo da Piperno.
Which means Fra Reinaldo, faced with an incomplete masterwork,
Yeah.
basically had to go rummaging through Aquinas' older notebooks and early writings to piece together an ending for the book.
That's exactly what happened. And what's fascinating here is the quirk of how Fra Reinaldo built this ending.
What did he use?
He pulled this material from Aquinas' much earlier work, specifically a massive commentary Aquinas wrote on the sentences of Peter Lombard.
Okay, give us some chronological context for that.
Aquinas wrote that commentary between 1235 and 1253.
Meaning he was young.
Very young. Aquinas was in his 20s, definitely under 30 years old, when he formulated the exact ideas we are about to discuss today.
That is just wild to think about.
Isn't it?
We're essentially reading the young Aquinas, but it has been pasted on to the very end of the old Aquinas' final monumental book. It's like watching the series finale of a critically acclaimed television show, only to realize the writers used the original rough pilot script to film the last episode.
I love that analogy. You are seeing the raw DNA of his thought process.
Yeah.
And it reveals so much about his intellectual evolution. In this early writing, you can clearly see the heavy, almost deferential influence of Peter Lombard.
Right, a theologian whom Aquinas reverently referred to as the master.
Exactly. Lombard was the standard textbook of the day. But here's the catch. As Aquinas aged and his own genius fully matured, his mind moved forward.
He evolved.
He did. In the actual later parts of the Summa Theologica, the older Aquinas sometimes took positions that completely and directly contradicted the master.
Oh, wow.
But because Fra Reinaldo used those early writings to plug the hole in the incomplete Summa, we are getting a snapshot of Aquinas' foundational, perhaps more traditional, thoughts on human sorrow.
That makes sense.
The editor of our text even includes a warning, noting that the compiler, Fra Reinaldo, was evidently very well acquainted with the old commentary, but perhaps badly acquainted with the later nuances of the Summa.
We have to keep that timeline constantly in mind.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that context so much because it humanizes him. It shows a genius in progress.
Yes, very much so.
And the subject matter this young genius was tackling is something every single person listening to this right now wrestles with.
Regret.
Regret. So I want to ask you, the listener, how do you process regret? Think about the last time you did something genuinely wrong.
Right.
When you hurt someone you cared about, or when you crossed one of your own deeply held moral boundaries. Is your sorrow just a feeling?
Is it just a heavy pang in your chest that you wait to pass?
Exactly. Or is it a deliberate structural action that you take upon yourself?
Because young Aquinas has a very specific, almost mechanical answer to this.
And it starts with a concept called contrition.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is contrition in this medieval scholastic framework?
Aquinas gives us a very precise definition. He defines contrition as an assumed sorrow for sins, together with the purpose of confessing them and of making satisfaction.
Okay, assumed sorrow.
I want to draw our attention to that first word, assumed. It's an assumed sorrow. It's not just a passive emotion that washes over you like a wave of sadness when you watch a sad movie.
Right, it's not something that just happens to you.
No, it's a sorrow you actively, consciously take upon yourself.
Yeah.
It involves a deliberate act of choice.
Which, in his framework, is absolutely necessary for it to be considered an act of virtue.
Precisely.
I love that distinction. The word assumed implies total agency. You are stepping into the sorrow on purpose. You are wearing it.
You are.
And to explain what this assumed sorrow actually does to the human mind, Aquinas uses this brilliant metaphor from physics.
This is arguably one of the most striking and useful analogies in the entire text.
He references an ancient text by Aristotle, the Meteorologica Book 4, to differentiate between two very specific physical actions, breaking versus crushing.
Let's think about the physical world for a moment. When you take a solid object, let's say a sturdy piece of wood or a long bone, and you apply force to snap it, you are breaking it.
Right.
You're sundering it into large, distinct parts. It is broken, but those parts still retain their fundamental solidity.
A broken branch is still made of solid wood.
Exactly.
Mm.
But crushing, which, by the way, is the literal Latin root of the word contrition, from contritio, is entirely different.
Okay.
When you crush something, you take that solid object and you reduce it into minute particles. You pulverize it until it loses its original structure entirely.
Okay, I can picture snapping a branch versus throwing a rock into a rock crusher until it's just dust.
Yes.
But how does that physical property connect to my psychological state? If I lie to my friend, what exactly am I pulverizing?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of medieval psychology, sin implies a certain continuity and solidity in the mind.
Okay.
When a person commits a sin, Aquinas argues that the foundational root of that action is always pride. Always. The person is clinging to their own judgment, their own desires over the divine law or the moral good.
Right.
They stray from the right path because their will becomes rigid. It becomes hard, stubborn, and inflexible. They are planting their feet and sticking to their own ground.
Right, they're inflating their own ego.
Yeah.
The will becomes this dense, impenetrable rock of self-interest.
Precisely. So to genuinely repent, it's not enough to just break that rigid will into a few smaller but still solid pieces.
You can't just snap it.
You can't just snap off the one specific bad habit while keeping the underlying stubbornness intact. That rigid, stubborn will must be utterly ground down to dust.
It has to yield entirely.
Yes, it must lose its hardened structure. That's why the act of casting aside sin is metaphorically called contrition, a literal crushing.
You are reducing the hardened pride into minute particles so that the mind completely gives up its own stubborn judgment.
Exactly.
That is such an intense, vivid image. It completely redefines what an apology is.
It does.
It's not just, oh, oops, my bad, I'll try not to do that again. It is the total pulverization of the ego that chose the wrong path in the first place.
A total dismantling.
So I shouldn't picture just snapping a twig. I need to picture throwing my own pride into a wood chipper.
The spiritual wood chipper, yes.
But this brings up a really important contrast in the text, and honestly, a very human reality.
Right.
Because most of the time, we aren't fully pulverized, are we?
No, rarely.
We just feel a little bit bad, we feel guilty, but our ego is still mostly intact. Aquinas actually has a specific technical term for that lesser state, doesn't he?
He does.
Patrician.
Patrician is essentially the physical and spiritual precursor to contrition.
Okay.
Returning to the corporeal metaphor, things are said to be attrite when they are worn away to a certain extent, but not completely destroyed.
Give me an example.
Think of a stone in a riverbed that has been rubbed smooth by the current over time. Or a piece of clothing where the fabric is frayed at the edges. It's worn down, it has taken some damage, but it's not altogether crushed into pieces.
So if I'm looking at this through a modern behavioral lens, what is attrition? Is it just a half-hearted apology?
Spiritually and psychologically speaking, attrition represents an incomplete, imperfect displeasure for the sins you've committed.
You're sorry, but...
But your will is still a little bit rigid. You haven't fully let go of your fundamental attachment to whatever you did.
Ah.
Or Very commonly, your sorrow is based merely on what Aquinas calls a servile fear.
Servile fear.
Yes, which is the fear of a servant toward a master. It's the fear of getting caught, the fear of losing your reputation, or the fear of divine punishment.
It's self-preservation.
Entirely. It is completely different from a true loving fear, a filial fear, like a child's love for a parent.
Where you're devastated simply because you offended the greatest good.
Exactly. Contrition is the perfect absolute crushing motivated by that filial love. Attrition is the frayed edges motivated by self-preservation.
This raises a really practical question, one that I'd immediately ask as a listener trying to apply this to my own life.
Okay.
Can attrition become contrition?
Ah,
Let's say I mess up at work. Initially, my regret is purely attrition. I'm just terrified my boss is going to fire me.
servile fear.
Exactly. But as the days go by, I reflect on it, and that seed of incomplete, selfish sorrow just sort of organically grows into the perfect, pulverized contrition. Does the fear of the consequence evolve into the sorrow for the fault?
It's a highly intuitive thought, but Aquinas gives a firm, unequivocal no.
Really? No evolution at all?
None.
Yeah.
And his reasoning here is incredibly precise and deeply rooted in his metaphysics. He acknowledges that there were heavy debates among his peers about this very question, but he sides with the opinion that it is fundamentally impossible for attrition to become contrition.
Why?
He explains that attrition and contrition do not denote a lingering habit or a state of being, but a specific act. A lifeless act of attrition, which is a sorrow entirely lacking the lifeblood of true divine grace, what he calls charity, simply passes away.
Wait, let's pause there for a second. When we hear the word charity today, we immediately think of donating money to a food bank or a nonprofit.
Right.
But Aquinas means something very different in this context, right?
That is a crucial clarification. In medieval scholastic theology, charity from the Latin caritas doesn't mean philanthropy. It means divine unconditional love.
Okay.
It is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things and our neighbor as ourselves. It is essentially the presence of God's grace actively working in the soul.
So an act of attrition lacks this divine charity.
Yes, it is just natural human fear.
Okay, so a sorrow without that divine love is lifeless.
Yeah.
It just happens and then it's gone.
Yes.
It doesn't just sit around in my subconscious waiting to be upgraded or quickened by grace later on.
Exactly. It's not like a software update on your phone where version 1 just downloads a patch and smoothly transitions into version 2. When true grace and charity finally enter the soul, that old, lifeless sorrow of attrition doesn't remain there to be magically transformed. It vanishes.
It vanishes.
True contrition requires a totally new, distinct act of the will, completely infused from the start by that divine love.
That is fascinating.
He makes a brilliant philosophical point here. You cannot have the identically same act arise from a totally new cause.
Okay, break that down.
Since a specific thing is brought into being but once, a sorrow that was born out of servile fear cannot suddenly become a sorrow born out of filial love. The engine driving the sorrow is completely different. Therefore, it must be an entirely new creation.
The big takeaway here is that an apology motivated purely by the fear of consequences, the classic PR non-apology, I'm sorry if anyone was offended because now I'm losing sponsorships,
Right.
that doesn't actually rewrite your internal behavioral software. To truly change, you can't just build on top of that selfish guilt.
Right.
You need to scrap it and generate an entirely new loving sorrow. You need the total ego death of contrition.
That is a perfect modern translation of the concept. You have to locate a new cause for your sorrow.
But what exactly is that new cause? What are we actually supposed to be grieving?
Right.
That's a great pivot into the next major theme of the text, the target of our sorrow. Because as we just established, it's really easy to be sorry when you get caught.
Very easy.
But Aquinas insists that true contrition must be for the fault, the sin itself, and absolutely not for the punishment.
This is perhaps the most difficult distinction for human beings to internalize. We constantly conflate the two.
Constantly.
We think we're contrite, we think our will is crushed, but we're actually just incredibly upset about the consequences we are suffering.
Yeah.
Aquinas addresses a very logical objection in the text. Shouldn't a penitent be sorry for the punishment? Isn't the loss of virtue or the stain on one's soul a punishment in itself?
It seems like it.
He answers this by returning to the mechanics of our primary metaphor, the crushing. He reminds us that the wholeness and the hardness that needs to be pulverized is found exclusively in the evil of the fault.
Well, why exclusively the fault?
Because the fault is the exact location where the will was stubborn. The fault is the active choice where the will refused to yield to the divine law.
Hold on, let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Isn't the punishment directly tied to the fault? If I lie to my partner, and as a result they break up with me, that breakup the punishment is the direct physical manifestation of my lie.
Yes.
Why can't I grieve the whole package? Why can't the loss of the relationship be the thing that crushes my will?
It's a fair question, and Aquinas wouldn't say you shouldn't feel sad about the breakup, but he is incredibly strict about the definition of contrition.
Okay.
Punishment, philosophically speaking, simply denotes a lessening.
A lessening.
Yes, you are being deprived of something in your example, the relationship. You suffer a punishment, you experience it passively.
I didn't choose the breakup.
Exactly. You don't actively, rebelliously will the punishment upon yourself in the same way you actively will the lie.
Ah.
Therefore, while you can and will certainly feel sorrow for a lessening, you cannot have contrition for it.
Because there's no hardness to crush?
Bingo. Contrition is specifically the crushing of a hard, rebellious will. You cannot crush a lessening. You can only crush a hardness.
That makes a frustrating amount of sense.
It does.
I can be sad about the breakup, but the contrition has to be laser-focused on the arrogant internal mechanism that thought lying was a good idea in the first place.
Precisely.
Contrition is about the rebellion, not the fallout.
Exactly.
Which logically leads to another fascinating boundary the text explores. What about original sin?
Yeah.
For listeners who aren't theologians, original sin is this foundational Christian idea of an inherited spiritual debt. It's the broken state of humanity passed down from Adam and Eve.
Right.
Does Aquinas think I have to actively crush my ego over a debt I didn't personally incur?
Aquinas is very consistent here, and his answer is no.
Oh.
We must remember the golden rule of this framework. Contrition is a crushing of the hardness of the will.
Our own will.
Yes. We did not use our own personal individual will to contract original sin. According to the theology, it was contracted from the origin of our infected human nature.
Okay.
Therefore, since our own active will didn't cause it, our own will cannot logically be crushed in relation to it.
So how do we feel about it?
We can feel a profound displeasure or a general sorrow about the state of original sin, but properly speaking, we cannot have contrition for it.
Because there's no active choice to pulverize.
Exactly. He notes that the medicine must always be proportionate to the disease. An inherited disease requires an inherited remedy like baptism in his theology, not a personal active crushing of a choice you never made.
I really appreciate that logical consistency. It keeps the responsibility entirely on the individual's agency.
It's very clean.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me, and I think for anyone who has lived long enough to accumulate some baggage.
Yeah.
What happens when you just completely forget a sin? Right.
We have all done it. We've all done something terrible, maybe when we were teenagers or in a bad phase of life, and then years later, the memory is just completely gone.
Completely wiped.
Yeah. If contrition requires me to crush my will regarding a specific fault, what if I literally cannot remember the fault?
This section is brilliant because Aquinas approaches it with the calm, methodical precision of a surgeon diagnosing a cognitive issue.
He doesn't just give a blanket answer.
No, he breaks down the act of forgetting into two distinct types.
Okay.
The first type is complete, absolute memory loss. The sin has escaped your memory altogether, and no trace remains.
Nothing.
Nothing. In this case, he says, you are actually excused from the duty of specific contrition.
Oh, really?
Yes. Why? Because you are physically and cognitively unable to fulfill it. God does not demand the impossible.
That's a relief.
It is enough, he says, that you are contrite in general for everything wherein you have offended God. Your general orientation of sorrow covers the blank spots in your hard drive. But there's a catch, right? There is always a scholastic catch.
There's absolutely a catch.
I knew it.
If that complete memory loss is ever cured, say, you run into an old friend and they recount a horrible thing you did to them, and the memory comes rushing back with full clarity.
Oh, no.
Then you are immediately bound to have specific contrition for it. The general umbrella no longer covers it.
Okay.
He uses a very practical economic analogy.
Yeah.
He compares it to a poor man who owes a massive debt but simply cannot pay it. He is excused from paying while he is completely broke.
All right.
But the very moment he comes into money, he is bound by justice to pay the debt. The obligation was paused, not canceled.
Okay, that makes sense for complete memory loss. But what is the second type of forgetting? Because Rarely do we forget things perfectly. Usually it's more of a lingering shadow.
Exactly, and Aquinas calls this second type a hazy memory. The sin has escaped from your memory in part, but in part, it remains. You know you did something wrong in a general sense, or you remember the emotion around the event, but you don't know what it was in particular.
Like waking up the morning after a terrible argument, and you know you were incredibly cruel, but you were so angry or tired that you can't remember the exact words you used.
That's the perfect example.
How does Aquinas judge that?
In this scenario, Aquinas says you cannot just shrug and rely on general contrition. You must search your memory with what he calls due care to discover the specific sin.
Due care.
You have a profound moral obligation to interrogate your own mind. You have to try to remember.
So you can't just let it slide.
No. If, after applying yourself with genuine due diligence, you still cannot find the specific details, then it is enough to be contrite for it according to how it stands in your hazy knowledge.
Okay.
But here's a brilliant, almost psychoanalytic twist, he adds. You must grieve not only for the hazy, forgotten sin itself, but you must also actively grieve for the negligence of having forgotten it in the first place.
Oh, wow. Wait, you have to be sorry that you didn't care enough to remember your own mistake.
Yes.
That is incredibly demanding.
It is demanding, but it's also deeply respectful of human agency and the weight of our actions.
I suppose it is.
It is essentially saying that our memories of our moral failures are critical data points for our soul. Letting them slip away through negligence or willful ignorance is a secondary moral failure.
Because it shows you don't value the cleanup.
Exactly. It suggests that a truly contrite person is highly vigilant about their moral state. They don't want to forget where they went wrong.
It is so interesting to compare that medieval theological view of memory to modern psychoanalysis.
It really is.
Today we talk about repressed guilt or the subconscious hiding trauma to protect the ego. Aquinas is saying, no, your ego doesn't get a free pass just because it conveniently misplaced the file.
Right.
Dig it up, and if you can't, apologize for your shoddy record keeping.
That is a very apt way to summarize it.
So if I am doing all this intense psychological excavation regarding my past, what about the future? Like, say I am going into a family Thanksgiving dinner. I know my uncle is going to say something inflammatory, and I'm 99% sure I am going to snap and say something awful back.
We've all been there.
Can I pre-apologize to God? Can I have contrition for a future sin?
It's a hilarious concept, the preemptive strike of regret. But Aquinas swiftly shuts that down.
Figures.
If we look at the strict definition, you absolutely cannot have contrition for future sins.
Because they haven't happened.
Because contrition is a constituent part of penance, and penance, by its very nature, always regards the past. You cannot pulverize a will that hasn't hardened into a choice yet.
Right, it's not a rock yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, he introduces a beautiful nuance here regarding how virtues interact with each other.
Oh.
He says that in all moral virtues, the first mover, the guiding force, is prudence. He famously calls prudence the charioteer of the virtues.
The charioteer of the virtues. I need to start using that in daily conversation.
It is a fantastic phrase. It means prudence holds the reins. It steers the other virtues where they need to go.
Okay.
So when the virtue of penance is operating, it actually acquires some of the forward-looking movement of prudence.
Ah.
Therefore, while the contrite person's proper act is sorrow exclusively for the past sin, the heavy influence of prudence makes them deeply cautious about future sins.
It changes their trajectory.
Yes. We don't call it contrition for the future, we call it caution. Prudence steers the sorrow of the past so it becomes the preventative medicine of the future.
So prudence takes the pulverized dust of my past mistakes and uses it to pave a safer road forward.
That is beautifully put.
Got it. Let's look at one more boundary condition, empathy.
Okay.
What about the sins of others? If my best friend does something objectively awful, maybe they embezzle money or betray their spouse and I'm devastated by it, can I experience contrition on their behalf?
Can you crush your will for them? We can and absolutely should grieve for the sins of others. In fact, Aquinas notes that out of divine charity, it is a requirement to grieve for our neighbor's ills.
Right.
But, again, we must stick strictly to the mechanical definition of the term. Contrition is the crushing of something hard and whole.
Right.
Therefore, the contrition must occur in the same subject, the identically same person, where the hardness of sin existed.
You can't crush their rock.
You simply cannot crush a hardness that exists in someone else's will. You can pray to be spared from the stain of their sins, as the text notes from Psalm 18, and you can weep for their spiritual danger, but you cannot repent for what you have not actively chosen yourself.
This level of precision is just staggering. Aquinas is drawing incredibly strict, impenetrable boundaries around what this one specific word means.
Yeah.
And this leads to a really interesting paradox in the text regarding the specific types of sins we commit.
Yes.
Because we don't always sin out of anger or greed. Some sins, like sloth and envy, are actually committed through sorrow, right?
They are.
Sloth is essentially a kind of oppressive sorrow about spiritual goods, and envy is a bitter sorrow about another person's good fortune.
Yes, exactly. And the objection raised in the text by Aquinas' hypothetical opponents is a very clever logical trap.
Let's hear it.
They argue if contraries are always healed by their contraries, which was a standard medical and philosophical axiom of the time,
Okay.
and if some sins are literally committed through the act of sorrow, shouldn't their remedy be joy rather than the sorrow of contrition?
It is a great point. If I am sinning by being sad and lethargic, how on earth does being more sad about my sadness fix the problem? It sounds like a downward spiral.
It does sound like a paradox, but Aquinas calmly resolves this by separating the material feeling of the emotion from the higher executive choice of the will.
Okay, separate them how?
He explains that contrition is opposed to sin, not in regards to the material feeling of sadness, but exclusively in regards to the choice of the will that failed to obey God. Think about it this way. The will actually wills to will something. In the case of envy, the will consciously chooses to engage in and indulge that bitter, sorrowful emotion.
Right.
The sorrow of contrition doesn't target the feeling of envy. It targets that rebellious executive choice of the will to indulge it.
Ah.
You're using a higher, rational sorrow to crush the will's choice, to wallow in a lower, sinful, emotional sorrow.
So it is sorrow curing sorrow, but they are operating on two completely different psychological operating systems.
Okay.
One is the raw emotion, and the other is the executive function.
Yes.
Which is the absolute perfect transition into section 3 of our deep dive, the depths of despair, and how we actually measure the pain of this regret.
a vital question.
So if my rational will is entirely crushed in this moment of perfect regret, what does that actually feel like?
Right.
Is contrition supposed to be the absolute greatest sorrow in the world? Because, let's be brutally honest here, physical pain, like a severe burn or a broken leg, or the profound emotional grief of losing a parent or a child, often feels vastly worse than the regret we feel over a moral feeling.
What's fascinating here is how Aquinas tackles that exact undeniable reality. He doesn't gaslight the reader.
He doesn't.
He doesn't deny our lived human experience that a broken bone hurts more than a broken commandment.
Oh.
To explain this, he introduces a brilliant foundational split in human psychology between the higher powers of the soul, which is the rational will, the intellect, and the lower powers, which is the sensitive, emotional, or physical part of our nature.
Okay, let's unpack these two powers because this seems central to his entire worldview.
Let's start with the higher power, the rational will. In this realm, contrition truly is and must be the greatest sorrow,
Why?
because the degree of displeasure should always be proportionate to the degree of malice or loss. Sin, in this theology, separates us from our last end, from the absolute greatest good, which is God.
Right.
Since God is above all things pleasing and good, turning away from him should logically be, above all things, displeasing.
That makes rational sense.
So purely on the level of rational calculation, objective truth, and the will's orientation, the sorrow for sin objectively surpasses all other possible sorrows. It is the greatest loss.
Okay, rationally, I understand that losing the ultimate good is the ultimate bad, but my nervous system and my tear ducts don't always get that memo.
No, they don't.
If I stub my toe in the middle of the night, or if a friend dies, I cry. I have a physical, violent, visceral reaction. But I might sit in a room, confess a severe moral failing, know rationally that it's terrible, and yet not shed a single tear or feel a spike in my heart rate.
And Aquinas completely understands and validates that. He says that in the sensitive part, the lower powers, contrition is not necessarily the greatest sorrow.
It's not.
No. The lower sensitive powers of our bodies are much more deeply and immediately moved by their own specific, tangible objects like acute physical pain or the visceral absence of a loved one than they are by abstract spiritual things that merely redound or trickle down from the higher rational powers.
So the body reacts to the body's problems first.
Always.
It prioritizes the immediate, tangible threat over the spiritual state.
Exactly. He explains it almost geometrically. The nearer the operation of the higher power approaches the objects of the lower power, the more violently the lower power reacts.
Okay, give me an example of that.
When your reason deliberates on a physical hurt, like seeing a wound on your arm, your body reacts strongly with outward tears and panic. But when your reason deliberates on a purely spiritual hurt, like the abstract concept of sin, the emotional bodily reaction might be significantly weaker.
That makes sense.
He literally writes that bodily tears flow much more quickly from a sensible hurt than from the profound spiritual sorrow of contrition.
That is incredibly validating for anyone who has ever felt guilty for not crying during an apology.
Truly.
It means you don't have to perform this dramatic, weeping, theatrical breakdown to prove you have true, profound contrition. The true contrition is an invisible shift in the rational will.
Perfectly stated.
But that raises another, almost darker question. Can you be too sorry? Can the guilt just absolutely destroy you? Because we have all seen people, maybe we've been these people who are absolutely consumed by self-hatred and paralyzing guilt over a past mistake. They can't function.
The text addresses this exact danger beautifully. The objection raised in the text cites earlier heavyweights, like St. Anselm and St. Augustine.
Okay.
And those saints used very poetic, extreme, almost terrifying language about their guilt. They talked about wanting the marrow of their bones to dry up or wanting to go blind with weeping over their sins.
It sounds like they actively wanted to be destroyed by their guilt, like a spiritual self-harm.
It does read that way, but Aquinas steps in to clarify and moderate this extreme rhetoric. He sets a hard, non-negotiable rule safeguarding the subject.
Safeguarding the subject.
This means that in all acts of penance, you must maintain your physical and mental well-being sufficiently to fulfill your ongoing duties in life.
You have to keep living.
Yes. He says that the rational displeasure in the higher will can never be too great. You can never rationally hate your sin too much, just as you can never love God too much. That rational calculus has no upper limit.
But the emotional bodily sorrow, the crying, the physical anxiety, that is a different story.
Yes. The sensible sorrow, the physical affliction and emotional distress you allow yourself to take on can absolutely be too great. Passions can have excess.
What happens if they do?
If sorrow lasts too long or is allowed to become too intense, a person might fall into deep despair, cowardice, or even physical death. And that fundamentally destroys the subject.
You can't do anything if you're destroyed.
Exactly. You cannot practice virtue, you cannot love your neighbor if you are destroyed by grief. He even contextualizes Augustine. He says that even though Augustine said he deserved to go blind for his sins, he didn't actually wish to go blind.
It was hyperbole.
He was merely using hyperbole to recognize the objective gravity of the fault.
Safeguarding the subject. I really love that phrase. It fundamentally reframes the purpose of guilt. The goal of regret isn't self-destruction, it is transformation. You have to survive the crushing in order to be rebuilt into something better.
That is the whole point of the system.
And this idea of measuring the sorrow brings up a really complex concept: proportionality.
Right.
If I commit a huge sin and a minor sin, do I have to actively measure out a larger cup of grief for the big one and a smaller cup for the little one?
Yes and no. Aquinas approaches this with his usual dual perspective. He says there are two ways to look at contrition.
Okay.
First, you could look at it as it corresponds to each single specific sin. In a higher appetite, your rational judgment, you absolutely should be more sorry for a more grievous sin, because a more inordinate act offends God more.
Sure.
If you purposefully betray a close friend, that requires significantly more rational displeasure and corrective action than telling a minor white lie to a stranger.
That makes intuitive sense. What is the second way to look at it?
The second way is looking at contrition as a general, instantaneous act of justification. The moment when you are repenting for all your sins at once, turning your life around.
Like a reset.
Exactly. In that specific, instantaneous movement of the will, you obviously can't realistically calibrate a different emotional intensity for every single past action you've ever committed.
That would be exhausting.
It would be impossible. But Aquinas argues that in this general contrition, you implicitly grieve them all, proportionately, by virtue of loving the whole.
What does he mean by loving the whole?
He uses a fantastic analogy of community. If you deeply love a community, say your hometown, you virtually love each individual member of that town more or less according to their specific relation to the common good, even if you aren't actively thinking of every single resident. Similarly, when you grieve for offending God the whole, the ultimate good, you implicitly grieve for your different sins in different ways, according to how much each one offended him. The general sorrow automatically scales to the specific weights of the sins.
It is like a master key.
Yes.
The general love of God is a master key that unlocks all the doors of regret with exactly the right amount of force for each specific lock without you having to do the math every single time.
That's a great way to put it.
Which leads us perfectly into the timeline of all this. Let's talk about the timeline of tears.
Okay.
If my rational will is crushed and I have this calibrated master key of sorrow, how long am I supposed to carry this pulverized will around with me?
Right.
Do I go to the grocery store with it? Does Aquinas put an expiration date on contrition?
This is where we get into one of the most beautiful and poignant concepts in medieval theology, the wayfarer.
The
A wayfarer, or viator in Latin, is a traveler, a pilgrim. Aquinas views the entirety of human life on earth, not as a static state, but as an active journey toward our final end, our ultimate home, which is God.
Okay, so we are all wayfarers, hiking up this massive spiritual mountain.
Yes. And in this journey, sin is a severe obstacle. It retards our course.
It slows us down.
When you step off the path to sin, the time you spent sinning was time that was given to you for your journey, and that specific time can never be recovered.
Wow.
Because of that permanent loss of time and forward momentum, Aquinas argues that the state of contrition, the rational detestation of the fact that you delayed your journey, remains during the whole of this lifetime. It never expires while you are on earth.
Wait, really? The whole of my life?
The whole of your life.
So what does this actually mean for my daily mental health? Should I just be miserable all the time? Should I be walking around with my head hung low, constantly grieving the time I wasted when I was 20?
Not at all. And this is where the absolute genius of his moral framework shines. He prevents this from becoming a depressive spiral by bringing in a quote from Augustine that the penitent should always grieve and rejoice in his grief.
Grieve and rejoice in the grief. I have to admit, that sounds like a complete emotional contradiction.
It seems like a contradiction until we remember the distinction we just made between the higher and lower powers.
Right.
The rational displeasure, the higher will's constant rejection of that past sin should be continual. You never look back and say, actually, that sin was a good idea.
Never.
But you must use other virtues simultaneously. Specifically, you have the virtue of joy in God. The joy you feel for your delivery, for the hope of pardon, for the grace you've received, doesn't lessen the rational displeasure. Paradoxically, it actually increases it.
How does it increase it?
The more you rejoice in God's immense goodness, the more you rationally detest the fact that you ever turned away from him in the first place.
Ah, I see. So the sorrow of contrition might be a hindrance to superficial worldly joy, but it is not a hindrance to the profound joy which is about God.
Exactly.
The grief and the joy feed each other. The happier I am in my restored state, the more I rationally regret the time I spent in the broken state.
Exactly. But Aquinas is so careful. He gives a practical warning here again about the emotional, passionate sorrow.
Safeguarding the subject.
Yes. He says that while the rational displeasure can never be excessive in duration, it lasts your whole life. The passion of sorrow, the actual feeling of sadness, must be moderated.
You can't cry forever.
You shouldn't constantly actively force yourself to feel miserable emotionally because, as we discussed, that would lead to despair and destroy the wayfarer. You summon the emotional sorrow moderately, as the end demands, perhaps when you are actively confessing or reflecting, but you don't live in a state of active weeping.
That perfectly maps out the timeline and the emotional boundaries for our physical lives.
He does.
But Aquinas doesn't stop at death, does he?
No, he doesn't.
What is the afterlife of regret? Because the text actually maps out the mechanics of sorrow after we die.
He does, and this section is a masterful synthesis of his entire Aristotelian and theological system. He looks at the three states of the afterlife: heaven, hell, and purgatory.
Okay.
And he asks a highly technical question: do souls have contrition after this life? To answer it, he breaks the concept of contrition down into three necessary mechanical parts: its genus, its form, and its efficacy.
Okay, genus, form, and efficacy. That sounds incredibly dense. Can we put that into a simpler analogy before we apply it to the afterlife?
Let's use the analogy of baking bread. The genus of contrition is sorrow. This is your raw material, your dough.
The dough, God.
But dough isn't bread yet.
Mm.
The form of contrition is that it must be an act of virtue, quickened by charity and divine grace. The grace is the yeast. It is what gives the dough life and makes it rise.
The yeast is grace.
Finally, the efficacy. True contrition must be meritorious and satisfactory. It must actually accomplish the forgiveness of sin. That is putting the risen dough into the oven to actually bake it into a useful loaf of bread.
Okay.
You need all three, dough, yeast, and heat, to have contrition.
Dough, yeast, and the oven, sorrow, grace, and merit. I love that. Let's take that framework and apply it to heaven.
In heaven, the blessed souls are perfectly united with God. They absolutely have charity and grace. The yeast is there in abundance.
We need yeast.
But they have no sorrow whatsoever. The absolute fullness of their joy completely excludes all capability of sorrow.
Ah.
Therefore, because the genus of sorrow, the raw dough, is missing, there is absolutely no contrition in heaven.
Makes sense. No sadness, no contrition. What about hell?
In hell, the souls definitely have sorrow. They have the dough. They are grieving their eternal punishment. But they completely lack the grace and charity that quickens the sorrow. There is no yeast. Their sorrow is entirely lifeless. It is an eternal bitter attrition, a regret solely over their painful punishment, not a loving contrition for offending God.
Right.
Therefore, because it lacks the form of charity, there is no contrition in hell.
Okay, so no contrition in heaven or hell. But what about purgatory? This is the middle state in medieval theology, a place of temporary purification. Do they have contrition there?
Purgatory is mathematically the most complex.
Yeah.
The souls in purgatory definitely have sorrow for their past sins. So they have the dough.
Okay.
And unlike the souls in hell, their sorrow is quickened by grace and charity. They have the yeast.
So they have the genus and the form. They have risen dough. Do they have contrition?
No.
Cool.
Because they lack the third and final requirement, efficacy.
The oven.
The oven. Contrition must be a meritorious act. It must earn grace. But souls in purgatory, having passed through death, are no longer wayfarers.
Ah, their journey is over.
Their earthly journey is officially over. Their status is locked in. They are no longer in the state of meriting new grace. They can only be cleansed of past stains.
Wow.
Therefore, while they have a beautiful, grace-filled sorrow, it is not technically contrition because it lacks the efficacy of merit. They can't put the bread in the oven to bake new merit.
That is wild.
Only in this physical, earthly life, as living, breathing wayfarers, can we have all three, the sorrow, the grace, and the ability to merit.
That is such a tightly woven, inescapable, logical system. It makes this mortal life the absolute critical proving ground. It is literally the only place in the entire cosmos where the medicine of contrition actually works.
The only place.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the cure in the clinic.
Yeah.
We know what contrition is, we know what it targets, we know how long it lasts, and we know it only works on Earth. But how does it actually work? What are the precise mechanics of forgiveness?
If we ask how a human act like contrition can possibly blot out a spiritual reality like sin, Aquinas makes a vital philosophical distinction between the principal cause and the material cause.
Okay.
God, and God alone, is the principal efficient cause of the forgiveness of sin. Only God has the power to forgive. But our human contrition acts as what he calls a dispositive or quasi-material cause.
There's another heavy scholastic term. What does it mean to be a quasi-material cause?
Think of it like preparing the soil in a garden for a seed.
Okay.
The soil itself does not create the plant. The genetic code in the seed, the sun, and the water do the actual creating. But the soil must be adequately disposed or prepared, softened, and turned over to receive that seed.
Right, you have to till the soil.
Contrition is our act of preparing our soul, the spiritual matter, to receive the sudden infusion of grace from God. The crushed will is the tilled soil. It is a necessary preparatory condition for justification.
Okay, but earlier we talked about how immense the consequences of sin are. We were talking about offending the ultimate infinite good. How can my finite, very limited human sorrow possibly prepare the ground enough to wipe out a massive mortal sin? Like, if my contrition is genuine but extremely brief or slight, does a tiny amount of true contrition suffice to wipe out a lifetime of terrible choices?
Yes. The text explicitly asks if a slight sorrow can wipe out a great sin. And Aquinas answers with the metaphor of a clinic. He says that spiritual remedies derive infinite efficacy from the infinite power operating within them.
Infinite power.
Think of a revolutionary bodily medicine, like a perfectly engineered antibiotic. That medicine is so inherently powerful that it heals both small scrapes and massive life-threatening infections equally well.
Right.
The healing power isn't generated by the size of your sorrow. The power is in the infinite grace of Christ that quickens the sorrow. As long as your sorrow fulfills the basic structural requirements of true contrition, as long as it is a genuine rational displeasure quickened by divine charity, it acts as an open channel for an infinite, unstoppable remedy.
So even the slightest moment of true contrition blots out all sin, because you are tapping into an infinite power source.
Exactly.
That is incredibly hopeful. It means you don't have to earn your forgiveness through sheer volume of tears.
Not at all.
But this logical conclusion leads to a giant, glaring theological roadblock for a lot of people, especially those outside the Catholic tradition.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
If my internal contrition, this perfectly crushed will that God already perfectly sees and knows, is what prepares my soul for infinite grace, why on earth do I have to go tell another human being?
Right.
Why is the vocal external confession to a human priest necessary at all?
That is the ultimate question of the spiritual clinic. Aquinas anticipates this entirely. To explain it, he uses an analogy from an older philosopher, Boethius.
What does Boethius say?
Boethius says if you want the physician to be of assistance to you, you must make your disease known to him.
Right, I get that if I go to the doctor with a stomach ache, I have to tell him where it hurts. But God is the ultimate physician, and he is omniscient. He already knows where it hurts.
God is the principal physician, yes. But in the sacramental system of the church that Aquinas is defending, the priest acts as God's deputized minister and as a judge dispensing a specific remedy.
A deputized minister.
You mentioned earlier that the medicine must be proportionate to the disease. The priest, acting as the clinician, needs to know the exact contours of the disease to apply the fitting sacramental remedy, which includes the enjoined satisfaction, the specific penance you are assigned to do to help heal the temporal habits of the sin.
The text mentions a fascinating historical objection here about Adam and Cain from the book of Genesis.
It does.
It says they were expected by God to confess their sins, and they existed thousands of years before the church, the priesthood, or the sacraments were ever established. So, isn't confessing your faults just a natural human behavior? Isn't it just natural law that we should admit when we are wrong?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of legal and moral philosophy, Aquinas makes a very sharp distinction between natural law and divine law. Under the dictates of natural law, which is just human reason deducing basic morality, it is entirely sufficient to acknowledge your sin inwardly before God. Natural reason tells you that you shouldn't lie or hide your actions from your Creator.
Right.
But the sacraments of the Church surpass natural reason.
How so? How does confessing to a priest go beyond natural reason?
Because the specific requirement to vocalize your most intimate sins to a human minister who wields what the Church calls the keys of the kingdom, that is not a product of natural human instinct.
Definitely not.
Nobody naturally wants to do that. In fact, natural instinct recoils from that kind of vulnerability.
It's terrifying.
Aquinas argues that this specific structure is a positive institution of divine law, established by Christ. The sacraments are profound professions of faith, and they go beyond what natural reason could invent.
Okay.
Confession is necessary not just as a natural psychological release valve for guilt, but because you are willfully submitting yourself to the authority and the keys that Christ explicitly entrusted to the ministers of the Church. It is an act of obedience.
It is a formalized structural submission. And the text notes exactly who is bound by this structure. It isn't just an optional therapy session for the overly anxious.
Exactly. The practice of confession existed before, but it became a strictly formalized mandate of positive church law at the Fourth Lateran Council under Pope Innocent III in 1215.
1215.
The law explicitly stated that absolutely anyone who has reached the age of discretion, meaning they are old enough to rationally discern right from wrong, is strictly bound to confess their sins at least once a year.
Wow, an annual mandate.
And the text we are reading gives 3 highly practical communal reasons for this mandate. First, so that everyone equally acknowledges they are a sinner in need of grace. There are no perfect elites.
Level playing field.
Second, so that people approach the Eucharist, the central sacrament, with proper reverence and a clean conscience. And third, most vividly, so that parish priests may actually know the moral state of their flock, lest a wolf may hide therein.
Lest a wolf may hide therein. That brings a whole new, almost protective, communal aspect to the practice.
It really does.
It's not just about my personal, isolated, soul-achieving peace. It is about the health and safety of the entire community. The priest has a duty to inspect the flock to make sure predators aren't hiding among the sheep.
Exactly.
Well, we have covered an immense, truly staggering amount of ground today. Let's do a brief recap of this intense journey through the medieval mind.
Sounds good.
We started with the foundational physical metaphor of contrition, learning that true regret isn't just breaking off our bad habits, but actively, deliberately pulverizing the rigid, stubborn pride of the will into dust.
To crushing.
The crushing. We learned the crucial difference between attrition and contrition, realizing that a half-hearted fear of punishment cannot just passively evolve. We need a completely new, infused act of loving sorrow to truly change.
Yes.
We discovered the demanding precision required of us, that we must grieve the fault itself, not just the resulting punishment, and that we must even hold ourselves accountable for the negligence of forgetting our own past sins.
Do you care?
From there, we explore the depths of despair, validating our human experience by realizing that true, profound sorrow lives invisibly in the rational will, even if our bodies don't physically weep.
Right.
We learned the absolute necessity of safeguarding the subject, ensuring our guilt transforms us rather than destroys us. We mapped out the lifelong timeline of the wayfarer, learning to balance continual rational displeasure with the joy of God's forgiveness.
Grieve and rejoice.
We saw how this life is the only place where the dough, yeast, and oven of sorrow, grace, and merit actually function together. And finally, we saw how this finite, perfectly crushed will acts as the tilled soil for an infinite grace, culminating in the highly vulnerable structural act of speaking it aloud to another human being.
It really is a remarkable, deeply cohesive system. It bridges acute modern feeling psychology with profound, transcendent theology in a way that is incredibly rare.
It really is a masterpiece of thought, even if it was stitched together from his early notes.
Absolutely.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We have spent this entire deep dive discussing how Aquinas repeatedly insists that the inner, invisible affections of the heart, the rational will, are infinitely more important to God than any external physical emotional display.
Right.
A single, quiet, invisible moment of true internal contrition is enough to act as a channel for infinite grace. Yet despite this massive foundational emphasis on the internal, invisible reality of the soul, Aquinas rigidly and uncompromisingly demands the external, highly uncomfortable, vocal act of confession to another human being.
He does.
If God already perfectly sees your crushed will, and if the infinite grace is already flowing the moment you achieve contrition, perhaps the ultimate purpose of forcing us to vocalize our failures isn't really to inform the priest listening. Perhaps it is to strike the final, fatal blow to our own internal pride. Maybe the only way to make that invisible crushing of the ego uncomfortably permanently real is to force it out of the safety of our own heads and into the physical air between two living people.
That is a powerful thought.
It is something to think about the next time you find yourself having to say the words, "I was wrong," out loud. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the medieval mechanics of regret. Keep asking the hard questions and keep exploring the why behind the what. We will catch you next time.